Democrats and the gains made by Trump. Wall Street Journal has a piece today titled "The New Driving Force of Identity Politics is Class, Not Race." Where have you heard that? And the subhead says that could upend how we have thought about politics for decades. And David, I'm just reading it.
I'm going to lose my mind. I'm going to walk into the ocean.
I've been thinking about this for like a decade.
I'm going to walk into the ocean like that. I can't.
But you've been thinking about it longer. You've been running on it longer. Like what? This is a problem of the Democrats making. The right can exploit it, and like you point out, the villains in the right-wing populism are trans people, are immigrants, or to some extent people of color, so long as it doesn't affect the vote. They will scapegoat the most powerless and marginalized on behalf of the most wealthy under the guise of right-wing populism. Some Democrats are talking about it, but I honestly don't have a lot of faith that, Chris Murphy, of course, had a good couple tweets and a video this week. I like it, but I don't have a lot of faith that he's going to be in the same place in 4 years, doubling down and saying, no, we have to run on strong populist policy.
Yeah, because, I asked Chris Murphy this, and I asked Ro Khanna this as well this week. Who are the villains in your story? Like, name some villains. I mean, I can name villains, and I'm not saying you have to be a spaz and just only name villains, but name some actual villains. I go back to this idea that when I was a speechwriter for Bernie Sanders, in fairness, we would write speeches for him, and then he would only use like 10 or 15% because all he wanted to do was play the hits. I mean, it was really actually kind of aggravating and annoying. Although in some ways he kind of had a point, like he was always on message. And so the stuff that he used that we would give him was stuff that would connect to the immediate news cycle. So it ended up working. But I when I was on that campaign, I wondered, why do people keep coming to these speeches if they know what he's going to say? I'm like, why? And I think it actually goes back to that metaphor of playing the hits. Why do people love going to the Fish shows or the Grateful Dead? I think it's a similar dynamic in this way, that Bernie Sanders, what we used to lovingly call the Bernifesto, when he would do the Bernifesto, it was one of the few, if only, politicians who was willing to give speeches just naming villains. And that was cathartic and comforting to people to hear over and over again. At least there's somebody in elected office who's not on the right talking about the villains. Okay. That makes us feel like, that makes the audience not feel insane in their own internal monologue, knowing about the villains in the world, that no one else on the centers or center left is ever talking about it. Okay, this one guy is, I want to go hear that. But that is something that makes the Democratic Party uncomfortable, because the Democratic Party, as I wrote in my recent piece right after the election, the Democratic Party operates as a Venn diagram. On one circle is what the donors want or can accept. The other circle is what the voters want or at least can accept. And in the middle of the Venn diagram is a very small set of issues that both sides either want or can accept. And those are the issues that the Democrats typically campaign on: democracy, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, important issues. Not saying they're not important, but in order to appeal to the working class and tell a story about economic villains, if you don't want to tell a story about cultural villains, right? The right is completely comfortable telling stories, making up stories, cultural villains, immigrants, liberals, et cetera, et cetera. If you don't want to talk about, and I think that's right, you don't want to create cultural villains. If you want to talk about villains in the economy, which voters I think want you to, that's on the voter circle, you're going to offend all the donors in the donor circle. And so to get back to your question and your point about people like Chris Murphy, I'm glad they're speaking out about this, and maybe there's going to be a tectonic shift. But the reason why Bernie Sanders stands out and people would go to his speeches, and because he seemed so anomalous in talking about the villains, is because most Democratic elected officials don't want to talk about the economic villains because they don't want to offend the donor circle on which they rely for money to fund their campaigns. Now, you can say, listen, that's a rational decision. They need money. They need resources to run their campaigns. And I think there's an argument there that ultimately at the bottom of all of this is what we talk about in Master Plan, our audio series about the 50-year plot to legalize corruption, that at the center of all of this is you can't chase big money and also appeal to the working class in a way that tells villain stories about big money. And that's the fundamental quandary here. And how it gets broken, I think, is the central question for the Democratic Party. And I don't have a great answer because now they're out of power. It's not like they're going to pass public financing of elections, which would allow people to run for office without having to rely on legalized bribes. In other words, severing the party's formula from that donor circle. They can't do that now. They never really made a real effort to do it, at least not in many years. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think recognizing that the money chase is at the center of this problem would at least move us beyond the denial phase, which I still think we're in the denial phase, right? Why are the Democrats still focused on the Chuck Schumer theory of we're going to get 2 moderate country club Republicans and who cares about the working class Democrats that we're losing? The reason that formula exists is because you can appeal in theory to these mythical Rockefeller Republicans, upper income country club Republicans. You can appeal to them on culture, on democracy, on reproductive rights in a way that won't offend your donors. To try to appeal to the much bigger pool of working class voters by not only putting forward populist policies, but telling a populist story about economic villains in the economy, to do that, you're going to really piss off your donors. And the Democrats have shown no desire, no motivation, no courage to do that as a party.
Well, and when you talk about telling this story about, the economy and these class issues and economic villains, as you call them, it seems like when it comes to speaking to some of these constituencies in these like deindustrialized parts of America, Michigan and elsewhere, that would also involve acknowledging their own culpability and their own complicity in creating these exact economic conditions, right? Which it seems also like something that they're completely unwilling to do, to talk about the failed strategies of the last 30, 40 years that they've been, going along with themselves. And they seem completely unwilling to do that.
I think I agree with you. I certainly agree that they haven't been willing to do that up until this point. I think the one thing that I'm like an eternal optimist trapped in a pessimist's body, because you wouldn't do this work for as long as I've done it if you didn't have some kind of optimism, sort of buried in there. And I do wonder, again, I go back to talking to Chris Murphy, and I'm not pinning all my hopes on, him in particular, but a kind of rank and file Democrat from a Democratic state, a state that has had in the past some really horrible Democrats, right? I mean, really horrible, like Joe Lieberman, Chris Dodd. I mean, Connecticut is not a place that has produced like really great, maverick Democrats. So my optimistic brain, part of my brain, says, if Chris Murphy is saying the era of neoliberalism is over, if Chris Murphy, sort of at the center of the Democratic Party, mainstream Democrat, is saying that we really screwed up by what we did with NAFTA and, this obsession with the market and the like, to me, that says maybe this really is a potential wake-up call. Now, maybe it's only a wake-up call for 2 weeks, right? And we're just going to all, the Democratic Party is going to go back into, resistance liberal mode. I think that's entirely possible. It's actually really it's likely, but I guess I'm allowing on my better moments or my more optimistic moments, allowing myself to say, listen, you just got the shit kicked out of you by Donald Trump for a second time. And I think there is a point where you say, listen, if this is not a wake-up call, then the party really may be completely irredeemable. I don't think we're yet there. We're going to have to see how it plays out in the next year or 2 years, because these shifts don't happen overnight. But I'm very interested to see what happens in the next year or two with the Democratic Party, granted, as the entire country and world is probably set on fire by the Trump administration. I just think that it does feel like a potential pivot point. I mean, then again, you turn on cable news, and as I've joked on social media, you turn on cable news, and it's like, oh, seems like the election proved that Bernie Sanders' entire theory of politics is correct. For more on that, let's go to our panel of former Bush officials who lit the world on fire, as well as Obama and Clinton aides who destroyed the Democratic Party and its possibility of winning for the foreseeable future. Right? I mean, there still is this attempt. There's like this simultaneous like acknowledging that Bernie was right, that his theory of working class politics may have been correct. Even David Brooks is admitting it. And yet this like, okay, for more on that, let's go back and talk to the people who created the disaster, as opposed to, why don't we talk to the people who've been right all along?
It's also an unwilling, I think part of it is they don't, or they feel safer now saying it because Bernie's not going to run for president in 2028. It's just,
I think that's true.
Right. I think a big part of it is like, all right, he's out of the way. Oh, wait, yeah, you did make some good points. Good job. And then the people who are going to be around are also saying, like Felipe Reigns, who has lost 3 presidential elections. I mean, asterisk on 2000. He's saying the far left is just holding our party hostage, and we just really have to tack to the middle. But the thing is, like, there's an unwillingness for them to even. Yeah, one more. The next time is going to work.
Well, in fairness, there's a problem where the term "the left" isn't defined, doesn't even mean anything anymore. I mean, it doesn't mean anything. Or maybe it means so many different things that it's lost its meaning. I mean, I'm not sure I would, based on what people perceive the left to mean, I'm not sure I would call myself as being on the left. I mean, I know what my politics are, but, the left's focus, the part of the left, I'm putting the left in quotes here, the part of the left that's focused obsessively on identity politics, and in fact, focused on weaponizing identity politics to kill off populist economic politics, that is defined as the left. And if that's the left, then that left is a problem, right? Like,
I see that more as the liberal wing.
I agree. But I think when Hillary Clinton says if we break up the banks, that won't end racism, I mean, that was a direct use of identity politics to try to destroy populist economic politics. If that is leftism, then the left is a problem. And frankly, I think there are a lot of Trump people who do think that's what the left means. When they hear the term the left, they're talking about the weaponization of identity politics against populist economic politics.
They think
that's
it's
what
like
they think of the
people
left.
of color or non-binary people being in like Disney cartoons or whatever. That's what they think the left means.
That's what they think the left is. They don't think of the left as the trade union movement, populist, left of center economic politics, right? They think Elizabeth Warren is on the left because of the whole so-called Pocahontas scandal, right? They don't think she's on the left because she's trying to regulate and crack down on the banks, right? And I'm not coming at and criticizing Elizabeth Warren. What I'm saying is the whole term doesn't really mean anything. So in some ways, when Felipe Philippe Reigns says, it's the problem with the left, I want to like respond with the hot dog guy being like, we're all trying to figure out who did this, right? It's like the Clinton folks and the Obama folks helped create the idea that the left is an identitarian movement in opposition to populist economic politics. Like, that's the left. If that is the left, and I'm not saying I accept that that's left, but I think a lot of people perceive that to be the left, then yes, that version of the left is a humongous problem for the Democratic Party. That doesn't have to be the left, though, as we're talking about. I do think the value of Bernie Sanders speaking out after the election, Chris Murphy speaking out after the election, there's a couple other House members who've spoken out after the election, that they've basically said, Chris Murphy said it explicitly, the tent pole of the Democratic Party needs to be economic tent poles, not necessarily cultural tent poles. I do think that suggests that there's an understanding that the definition of left has been so badly manipulated and distorted, and to the point where it's lost its moorings and hurt its political efficacy. And I think we need to understand that identity politics are fundamentally different from economic populist politics. We need to just be honest about that. I mean, I'll tell you about this. There was a moment on the Bernie Sanders campaign, it's actually pretty early in 2019, where I remember being super disturbed about it. Not that I was surprised about it, but it had just become so explicit. And I think identity politics really, hopefully that was the moment that it kind of peaked, like it really peaked. And the party's going to start figuring this out. But he was at this event the event was called the She the People event. Okay, and it was supposed to be a forum about issues of significance to Black women, which is totally legitimate to talk about. And Bernie ended up getting booed when he started talking about raising the minimum wage and Medicare for all and universal social programs. The implication being that he wasn't speaking to the specific concerns of Black women. Now, Black women, people of color generally, would disproportionately benefit from raising the minimum wage, Medicare for all, universal programs, because people of color are disproportionately harmed by the current economic system. But identity politics was the priority, as opposed to populist economic politics, universal social programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that was the moment where I was like, wow, this has gotten out of control, where you're not, the litmus test is how much you can flaunt your adherence to identity and identity politics, as opposed to New Deal politics or New Deal style politics of economic populist politics. And my hope is that the party wrestles with that problem. The party comes to a better understanding right now after this election that entire trend in politics, which was punctuated by that Clinton statement, we're not going to end racism if we break up the banks, which is sort of, emblematic in that Bernie Sanders situation I just described, that we have to move beyond that. And by the way, one last point on this, the crescendoing of that politics, it's really important to mention this, the crescendoing of Democrats defining themselves on identity politics coincided with people of color leaving the party in droves to vote for Donald Trump, right? So it's not like you have to be an identity politics, has to define the party in order to keep people of color in your political coalition. In fact, the data lines up to suggest the more you become an identitarian party, the more you are going to lose the votes of people of color who don't want to be seen as just, seen through the prism of race and ethnicity.
Yeah, I mean, famously, I was thinking about like some of the people that have come on after this election to talk about, hey, maybe this approach is the right way to do things. And James Carville was one of those people saying maybe Bernie Sanders was right about some of this stuff. And I thought that was hilarious because I was looking at some of the footage of the media freakout after Bernie won that Nevada caucus in 2020, largely driven by working class Latino voters in Nevada, to your point. And James Carville was one of the people on TV going, this is the worst thing that's ever happened. Vladimir Putin is celebrating right now.
Vladimir Putin.
Like it's just amazing. I just like the same people. Like saying now maybe there's something to this. I think that's really incredible.
I toggle between better late than never. Like, fine, if it took you this long to figure it out, at least you figured it out. And I hate you all. I just want to walk into the ocean. I've been saying this forever. Where were you? You all created this problem. We try, like that scene in Don't Look Up, where towards the end, he's caught in that traffic jam, and now you can see the asteroid coming in, and he gets out of his car, the DiCaprio character, and he says, and people are all of a sudden scared that they can now see the comet coming in. And he says, we've been trying to tell you. We've been trying to warn you, right? And like vindication is not consolation. I don't feel like haha, I told you so. I was right. It's not, but I had been working at this for almost 30 years, and to see these people who it's not that they were too stupid to listen, it's that they were too corrupt to listen. They were making too much money off the current grift of turning the Democratic Party into an identity party instead of an economic populist party, that they didn't want to listen. They didn't care. They cared about themselves, right? And I guess to go back to like my optimistic voice, I said this to Jeff Weaver, Bernie's former campaign manager. I said, I think the best thing that I had hoped for after Bernie lost in 2016 and 2020 was that he would ultimately become something akin to a Democratic version of Barry Goldwater, what Barry Goldwater was to the Republican Party. That Barry Goldwater lost the biggest landslide election in 1964. The sort of liberal-ish New Deal tolerant wing of the Republican Party then kept winning for a little bit and winning the internal Republican Party debate after that, and at the presidency, Nixon, Ford. Not that, Nixon was no great liberal, but he, as I said, like sort of New Deal tolerant. But that Goldwater ultimately inspired people like, and the movement behind people like Ronald Reagan for a takeover of that party. First a challenge in 1976, where Reagan primaried the incumbent Gerald Ford in a very close primary, and then ultimately winning the presidency in 1980, that Bernie Sanders, perhaps the best thing to happen would be his brand of politics and him playing a role similar to Goldwater, a kind of ideological inspiration, a visionary, a prophet, somebody who saw the way to win through a more moral politics, more ideological viewpoint, ideological not in a pejorative way, but in a positive way, had a vision. And I said it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. This election feels like the Democrats literally followed him up at the DNC with a speech by J.B. Pritzker bragging about being a billionaire. It doesn't seem like anyone gotten the message. And Jeff said to me very astutely, very optimistically, well, look, it took 16 years between Goldwater and Reagan. 16 years. 1964, Goldwater gets crushed. 1980, Reagan wins in a landslide. We're only now, if Bernie Sanders really wasn't on the national scene, like in the national consciousness, until, let's say, late 2015, 2016, it's only been 4 or 5 years. So maybe this is the moment, right? You put it on a chronological map here, right? Like Gerald Ford gets defeated 8 years after, gets defeated by Jimmy Carter 8 years after Goldwater's landslide. Right? Kamala Harris just got defeated 4 years after the party lost to Trump the first time. It's not an exact chronology, but maybe that's the same pivot point. When I think that when the Republicans lost in 1976, it was a real wake-up call to them. And 4 years after the election that was a referendum on Watergate, Ronald Reagan won, right? I mean, I'm sure after the 1976 election, Republicans felt conservative activists, right, the really hard, the Reagan, this nascent movement, felt completely demoralized. The Republican Party probably did too. There's recriminations, etc. Right? Probably felt that way. And then 4 years later, they won a landslide that changed the country. So I don't think we know where we are in this version of the story. Like maybe we're at that moment. Or maybe I'm just an incredibly dumb optimist and we're not at that moment. And again, I should just go walk into the ocean.
I think that you can always find a cause for optimism to wrap up on. It's always refreshing, and it lifts my spirits, even though usually the bulk of the conversation is about how everything